Just after 9:30 today, we'll observe a moment of silence because today is September 11th, in memory of those who lost their lives on September 11th. So I'll stop the meeting and we can observe that moment of silence. At this point, it's my pleasure, my honor to introduce Dr. Kent Rockford, the Acting Undersecretary of Commerce for Standards and Technology and the Acting Director of NIST, quite a title, who many of you met at the previous TGDC meeting. Dr. Rockford, one, I want to thank you for coming to Silver Spring, participating in the meeting, and being with us here this morning.
Thank you, Matt. And I'm very glad to be with you here today. In accordance with the Help America Vote Act and as Acting Director of NIST, I'm honored to continue to serve as chairman of this committee. Now, over the course of the last year, we've seen a lot of press surrounding elections, from early concerns over compromised voter registration systems to the designation of election systems as critical infrastructure and follow-up activities. The cybersecurity of election systems is of paramount importance to the integrity of the election process. And I hope this will be at the forefront of our thoughts while we consider revisions to the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines. Indeed, the task of this committee is to serve as the technical advisor to the Election Assistance Committee, and by extension to the states that administer elections, and that's never been more complex or more essential to our democracy. And the specific charge to this committee to assist the EAC in developing voting standards and guidelines for voting equipment and technologies, it's a critical requirement for making accessible, accurate, and secure elections possible. So I want to thank all of you for serving on this committee and for bringing your unique expertise to this effort. Each of you is an essential subject matter expert as we engage in the deliberations over the proposed new version of the Voting Systems Guidelines, the VVSG 2.0. And as you know, this version of the VVSG uses a new structure, going to have a high-level, unified set of principles and guidelines for voting systems. The draft has been developed by NIST through an open and transparent process that included bi-weekly meetings with experts from the NIST EAC public working groups. Now, as part of this development process, the principles and guidelines have been distributed to the EAC Standards Board, the EAC Board of Advisors, and the National Association of State Election Directors for comment and feedback. My goal for the group at this meeting is to carefully discuss the current draft and reach agreement, if possible, that it can be forwarded on to the EAC. The EAC, in turn, will seek further comment from their advisory boards and the public at large. So after introductory remarks this morning, we'll have presentations from Cliff Tatum from EAC, who will provide a review of the TGDC charter, NIST Mary Brady, who will provide an overview of the VVSG structure, development activities, and progress towards requirements and testing, the EAC, with the expectations for the review and adoption process for moving to VVSG 2.0, and from David Wagner and Diane Golden, who will give us an update on an EAC-sponsored meeting held in June to better address security and accessibility issues and how we can better harmonize those. After lunch, we'll then devote the remainder of the day to discussing the principles and guidelines, highlighting new areas for consideration. And during the afternoon, we'll hear from a number of NIST staff covering human factors, security, interoperability, and implementation-related topics. On Tuesday, we'll hopefully continue the VVSG 2.0 discussions as necessary, and hopefully by this time we'll reach consensus on the next steps. Afterwards, John Wack from NIST and John Jurley from Democracy Fund will provide updates on the common data format. Finally, our last two sessions will focus on cybersecurity. Josh Franklin from NIST will provide background information on how the threat model for voting and more broadly election systems has changed over time and provide some considerations for moving forward. And then our colleagues from the Department of Homeland Security will present progress with respect to the designation of voting systems as critical infrastructure. I do need to apologize in advance for schedule conflicts that will prevent my participation in the full meeting. However, you'll be in good hands. In keeping with the TGDC charter, Commissioner Masterson, the designated federal official, will take over as chair. And in addition, Mary Brady will be here to provide assistance as needed. So thank you, Commissioner Masterson and Mary. So on behalf of the commissioners in NIST, please know that we do appreciate your continued commitment to serving on this committee. and I look forward to your deliberations that help the nation improve the security, usability, and accessibility of our voting systems. So thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate you being here to open and chair the meeting. And while you're here, I want to thank you and your staff for the incredible work that they've done on VVSG 2.0 and their leadership. They've done great work, and so I think it's important to recognize that while you're here. They've been fantastic. Thank you. Well, good morning to all of you. Welcome to the Election Assistance Commission here in sunny Silver Spring. I want to thank not only Dr. Rockford and the NIST staff, but also the EAC staff that helped make this meeting possible, who put in yeoman's work on the development of VVSG 2.0, helping to run the public working groups. I want to thank you as TGDC members and the incredible work that you've done in the development process. And I want to thank the hundreds of people that have participated in the public working group. I think when the public working groups were established and we, kind of chartered off on this effort, we weren't sure the level of engagement. And we have been thrilled by the amount of participation by folks in all of the working groups, the amount of input people have provided, and the consistency. It hasn't dwindled, but in fact picked up as we've moved forward. This effort to develop VVSG 2.0 began with a reconstituted TGDC in July of 2015. Since that time, the effort has been done both in a public working group and the TGDC function. That TGDC meeting represented the first meeting of the TGDC in 4 years. The effort, though, on TGDC or VVSG 2.0 really began before that July meeting with the work of the EAC VVSG working group, the work that the NASED VVSG working group put together, and the recommendations of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, who recognized the need for updated standards that allowed for innovation and ensured accessibility and security of voting systems. Since that time, all of us in this room, hundreds of election officials, experts in cybersecurity, accessibility and usability, and citizens have dug into this work in order to contribute and develop the next set of voting system standards. Having guidelines that ensure accessible, accurate, and auditable elections is critical to the integrity of the election process moving forward. Given all that's gone on since July of 2015 in that initial meeting, and I don't have to remind particularly the election officials in the room of everything that's happened since that meeting, I think it's clear that this work has never been more important. As we discuss today and tomorrow and drive towards consensus on VVSG 2.0 in the next 2 days, I hope we all can appreciate what we've done as a group, what we're doing here today and over the next 2 days, and how incredibly important this work is. I want to thank all of you in advance for your time, for your incredible thoughtfulness and dedication to this effort. VVSG 2.0 represents a truly open, transparent, and collaborative effort to improve the overall accessibility, security, and functionality of voting systems, and I hope we can reach consensus and move forward to approve this important work. I want to thank you all, and we can begin the meeting with Mary, if you're ready, to brief us on NIST update. Or are we doing Cliff first? I'm sorry, if I could read an agenda. We're going to start with the federally mandated FACA briefing from the EAC General Counsel. This is where real news is made on this FACA briefing. So, Cliff, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Commissioner Masterson, thank you very much, and Mr. Chair, Mr. Rockford, thank you for the introductions. I just want a point of clarification. Are we going to establish a quorum before I present my part, or should we?
Sure we are, Counselor. Yes, we are. The question from the council was, are we going to establish a quorum? And we are. So we can go through and do a roll call of those participating, if that's all right. Okay. So EAC Board of Advisors Rep Linda Lamone. Here. EAC Standards Board Rep Greg Riddlemoser. Here. EAC Access Board Member Mark Guthrie. EAC slash NIST Technical Appointee McDermott Coots. Here. EAC slash NIST Technical Rep David Wagner. Here. Welcome. EAC Board of Advisors member Neil Kelly.
Here.
Yeah, the NIST director is present. Technical expert, EAC NIST technical expert Diane Golden.
Here.
NASED representative Judd Choate.
Here.
NASED representative Lori Agino. EAC Standards Board representative Robert Giles.
Here.
Representative EAC NIST technical representative Jeremy Gray.
Here.
Awesome, the voice of God from above. We are missing and not assigned an ANSI and IEEE rep, so they won't be reflected in the quorum here today. You're on.
Commissioner, we have a quorum.
All right, thank you. You may proceed with the FACA briefing.
Thank you very much. Pursuant to the Help America Vote Act. Thank you. Pursuant to the Help America Vote Act, Section USC 52 USC Section 2961, the Election Assistance Commission has chartered the TGDC as an advisory committee. According to the Federal Advisory Committee Act itself, we have submitted to the Register and to the Secretariat a charter on April the 13th, 2017. That charter specifically provides that there shall be the Director of NIST as the chair and 14 other members of select members from the boards and the bodies that you just named. Those individuals will be confirmed to serve on the committee, and the committee will conduct its business starting today. The role of the committee is strictly advisory. It provides the Election Assistance Commission with support for developing the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines. Each of the members who serve on the committee serves in either a representative capacity or as a special government employee. The representative capacity members are not subject to the ethics code or the conflict of interest statutes. However, they are admonished to adhere to sound business practices and to avoid the appearances of impropriety in any of their actions and conduct in conducting themselves and representing the board of the Technical Guidelines Development Committee. The special government employees, who have, of course, been notified as to who they are subjected to the ethics code and the financial conflicts of interest statutes, and, of course, are required to adhere to those rules and regulations specifically. As indicated, meetings that are conducted by the TGDC are in a public forum. They require a quorum. We have the quorum today. So unless there's other questions, Mr. Chair, I will close with that update.
Thank you, Councilor Tatum. I appreciate it. You all have been briefed now. We've fulfilled that obligation. So now we get down to the business of work, and we're going to start with a general update from Mary Brady and NIST, generally on the work that's been done since the last meeting, the process moving forward, all with a goal towards driving towards consensus on VVSG 2.0 at this meeting. The goal of this meeting and our hope is that you all can reach consensus on the recommendations to be sent to the EAC Executive Director per HAVA. And so Mary will start with a general update, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what VVSG 2.0 says. So with that, Mary, we'll turn it over to you for the update.
Thank you, Commissioner Masterson. Can everyone hear me? It's a little further back. So good morning, everyone. I'm Mary Brady. I'm the voting program manager from NIST, and I'm going to give you a bit of an update this morning on what's been happening. Maybe. That doesn't seem to work. There it is. What's this one here? just use this. We'll give that a shot. Thanks, Ryan. Okay, so a number of these topics, a number of folks in the room have seen some of these slides before, and I apologize in advance for those of you who have, but some of you haven't, so I wanted to make sure that, that we were all up to date. I'll start with an overview of the development process, talk a little bit about scope and structure and how we came to it, tell you a bit about principles and guidelines, where we are with respect to the requirements and the test assertions, and leave you with some parting thoughts. So as you all know, the development process for the VVSG this time around has been a little bit different. That in past versions of the TGDC, NIST provided technical support to the TGDC. We would bring that input into this meeting. When we got to the point that the TGDC was happy with a draft, they forwarded it on to the EAC, who would then send it to the Standards Board and Board of Advisors and out for public comment. This time around, we created these public working groups, and the idea was that we would try to tap into as many experts as possible and keep people advised of the process as we were going, rather than waiting till after the fact to engage the broader community. So these public working groups were spawned from a variety of efforts that were ongoing prior to 2015, and we started with 3 election groups: the pre-election, election, and post-election, and 4 constituency groups: usability and accessibility, sometimes we use the term human factors, cybersecurity, interoperability, and testing. Now, the truth of the matter is the 3 of those 4 constituency groups have been very, very active. We've yet to launch the testing group, but I think that's going to change here shortly. The public working groups, as Matt mentioned in his opening remarks, have been very active. Initially, the election groups went through and developed the process models, and the constituency groups have been very active with the principles and guidelines. Here you can see some numbers. You know, pre-election 103, election 107, post-election 96, and the constituency groups with 105 in UNA, cybersecurity 121, interoperability 158. And even though there's nothing going on in the testing group, we still have 84 members that are ready and waiting to get to work. We had an entire process working on reaching consensus on the VVSG scope, and that's been played out in previous TGDC meetings. The election groups developed process models that were aired with the TGDC, with the Standards Board, the Board of Advisors, and with NASED. We developed use case scenarios, and ultimately the EAC put forth 17 core functions that define what a voting system is and provide us with scope. That's been agreed to by the Standards Board, the Board of Advisors, and NASED. We've also, at the same time, while we're looking at scope, we were looking at structure, and we had this trade-off between high-level principles that we could all participate in defining and agree to, and the low-level test assertions that are necessary for testing voting systems. So we've come up with a 4-pronged approach, if you will, where you have the principles and guidelines at the very high level. You have requirements that serve as a basis for the manufacturers to build to, and then the lower-level test assertions that can be used by the voting system test laboratories to test voting systems. Just as a reminder, here are the pretty process models that the election groups worked very hard on. What we did is we took the VVSG, and this is actually a word cloud from the VVSG, 1.1, and we overlaid the process models on the VVSG, and we questioned everything. We wanted to know if it was there, should it stay? Where were the gaps? And how could we make use of the best research to date in a variety of areas? And we brought those experts to the table to discuss all aspects of voting systems. We came out with this 50,000-foot view, and a number of the principles and guidelines were actually encapsulated in this 50,000-foot view. It all starts with the voter, the folks who are actually placing their votes. So you need to have all the information available in whatever mode that is useful for the voter. And it needs to be available, both from a usability perspective and an accessibility perspective. Accessibility is the law, and we need to abide by what's in HAVA and the other federal laws there. Throughout the voting process, we have to be sure that we keep the integrity of the ballot secret, that we maintain the integrity of the ballot and we honor the secret ballot. We have to provide for auditing at the back end, and while we put together these voting systems, they have to interact in well-known ways, and the entire process has to be transparent. So with that, we put together the principles and guidelines. Initially, we had 18 principles and 53 guidelines. We started with the early versions, had over 200 pages of the VVSG. In early presentations, we got it down to 38 just for usability and accessibility. Another version, we got down to 20, then to 10, and finally to 5. So every word has been well vetted throughout the public working groups, and the public working groups have been, just a great asset for us to call upon and to work with. We presented the principles and guidelines at a variety of venues, at NASED, at Standards Board meetings, Board of Advisors. We sought feedback. We discussed within the particular working group, whether it was cybersecurity or usability and accessibility or interoperability, and also between the public working groups. We simplified the text, we removed duplicates, and we merged categories. So today we have before you, I think in your packets, the current version of the principles and guidelines. There's 15 principles and 52 guidelines. And we froze this version a couple of weeks ago prior to the NASED meeting that was out in Anaheim. But the truth of the matter is there are some comments that are continuing to come in that we'll deal with as part of the public comment process. So work continues.
I would note also those are available both at EAC.gov and vote.nist.gov for folks to check out as well. And it's only 5 pages, so it's a quick read.
It's a quick read, yes. So that's the majority of what we'll be discussing today is the principles and guidelines. And let me just give you a quick shot at them. These, it's starting with design and implementation, high quality design and implementation, transparency, interoperability, equivalent and consistent voter access, voter privacy, marked, verified, and cast as intended, robust, safe, usable, and accessible, auditable, ballot secrecy, access control, physical security, data protection, system integrity, detection and monitoring. As part of these sessions this afternoon, there are folks here from the NIST staff, from the NIST voting program, who will go over these in detail. We'll highlight changes from VVSG 1.1, and we'll engage you in quite lively discussions, I'm sure. One thing to note is, initially we had these principles and guidelines broken down by categories. So we had human factors, usability and accessibility, we had security, we had interoperability. In the end, as we removed duplicates and did some merging, the current thinking, or the thinking was that they really all need to work together, that it's an integrated set of guidelines and they shouldn't be separated by category.
Mary, if I may, this is actually a good point to stop so that we can do a moment of silence at 9:37 a.m. For those who lost their lives or were impacted on the terrorist attacks on 9/11. So if we could all just take a moment of silence of remembrance. Okay, thank you all. I appreciate it, and it helps put in perspective all of this and this work. So Mary, thank you, I appreciate it.
So as we go through the principles and guidelines this afternoon, we actually won't go through them in this order. We've reordered them a little bit just to make sure that you're awake and paying attention. The working groups didn't stop with the principles and guidelines. As they were continually discussing the principles and guidelines and updating them, they were also working on requirements. So I'll talk a little bit about the work that's been done on requirements, first by the Human Factors Group. They've been working on turning these abbreviated requirements into detailed requirements, and you all remember the tabular description of the abbreviated requirements, and they're turning out white papers at an incredible pace on various aspects of the research that's been done in the usability and accessibility areas. So here are the abbreviated requirements. They were based on a gap analysis performed by the working group, and they highlight the changes and provide further insight. One of the aspects of the abbreviated requirements which will carry through into the detailed requirements is they're all now tagged with update, new, review, combine, move, and remove the abbreviated requirements. But what we'll retain as we move into the actual requirements is the legal accessibility requirement, that this will be highlighted, throughout the requirements and the test assertions. Right now it's identified by a wheelchair icon, and this indicates that it's either required by HAVA, Section 508, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or the Voting Rights Act. This is all backed by a set of a whole body of research, which has been encapsulated in a variety of white papers that have been put together. The initial topics were in text size, contrast, navigation from the review screen, scrolling on the ballot, and assistive technology in the polling place. More recently, the group has taken a look at election materials, including bilingual ballots, and at looking at the combination of universal design, user-centered design, usability, accessibility, and ISO standards. It's an active area with a number of bodies that are participating, looking at all of those and bring to bear on the voting system guidelines what's necessary. Their current status is they've completed the analysis for updating the requirements, and they're in the process of reordering them according to the order that we'll present later today, and to continue the development of the detailed requirements. In the cybersecurity area, we went back to, some of the aspects of cybersecurity were in the 2007 TGDC recommendations, and we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so we want to retain, good work that has been done in the past. So there's been a review of the 2007 TGDC recommendations, as well as some comments on remote ballot marking. Let me just, I don't know if there's an internet connection here, but let me just try. To pop out to the website.
Nothing like just trying, Mary.
Hey, I like to live life on the edge.
If the lights go out, we're blaming you.
So here are their working documents. Are the lights going out?
No, we got split screen. There's a remote now.
I can go back and forth. It's okay.
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 It was okay. I'm not sure what you've done here now.
Well, didn't you want the website up?
Yeah, but I wanted it to be on this screen so I could click.
Now you've done it.
Let the record note that
Yeah.
it's Ryan that's...
Yeah.
Didn't see anything.
Oh. Oh,
Yeah, that's right. There's
That's
only
all right.
due.
I'll just look over there.
So
It's an excellent
we
try.
have a white screen. So there's two different screens.
Okay, but it's still not showing over there. So anyway, if you go out to the website, what you're seeing on this screen here is a list of working documents. And what they've done is they've gone through over the course of the summer, from June until the present time, and they've issued a gap analysis for each of these areas: auditability, ballot secrecy, system event logs, communication security, physical security, cryptography, setup, and I think if and then there's a couple other categories beyond that. software installation, access control, and system integrity management. And it was a cross-check against the current principles and guidelines, but they've also been able to map all of those requirements that were pertinent to moving forward and have identified gaps. So they're well on their way to creating requirements that will map to the principles and guidelines. In the interoperability area, also known as the common data format, we have near final versions on cast vote records, event logging, and updates to the election results, progress on the voter registration interchange, voting models, and voting variations. John Wack is with us and will provide a more in-depth review of the progress to date tomorrow during the common data format session. And again, here, we've set up a GitHub repository, and there are some early requirements, or draft requirements for cast vote records and for event logging. In addition, we've had some help from Democracy Fund. Particularly in the initial development focus on the election process models. You all remember, some of the very complex diagrams that Kenneth Bennett had provided to us in the past. That work continues. Sean July has been working on it. And also in the deployment area, Katie Owens-Hubler is the primary lead there, so we're thankful to have that the help from those folks as well. In some of the other areas that sort of come under the high-quality design and high-quality implementation, we've done a review of the software, hardware, telecom, quality assurance, configuration management, the testing and the TDB packages, and we're about ready to embark on that effort as well. On the test assertion front, although we haven't really kicked off the testing group, and NIST has continued to develop test assertions. They've been developed for 1.0 and more recently for 1.1. They articulate the requirements as testable logical statements. And if you all remember, that there was a process that was set out to do this, that we started with NIST drafting the test assertion, sharing them with the labs, the voting system test laboratories and the EAC, coming to consensus there. And when consensus was reached, providing them to the manufacturers as for comment and feedback. So as I've said many times before this group and others, that we're not actually giving them the answers to the test, but we are giving the manufacturers the questions that are going to be on the test. These are necessary for identifying the breadth and depth for testing voting systems, and it provides consistency across the voting system test laboratories. So right now, the status for VVSG 1.1, there's nearly 1,200 assertions developed to date, covering six sections and addressing the functional requirements and general usability requirements. And here's just sort of between the overall system, here's a breakdown of the various categories. So in summary, the principles and guidelines, the draft is ready for the review, and we'll see that review this afternoon. We'll step you through highlighting various changes from previous versions. It's been developed through an open and transparent process, the working group process. We've had a phenomenal access to a phenomenal set of experts during this entire process. The public working groups are busy, and they've already started on the requirements. In the human factors area, the research is complete. They have abbreviated core requirements that they're translating into, the longer version of the requirements. Cybersecurity, a gap analysis has been done. They've mapped the 2007 recommendations to the principles and guidelines. Interoperability, there's much progress on the common data format. And in testing, particularly, I'm looking at McDermott here. I'd like to propose that we expand the focus to implementation and testing, and have the group not just looking at testing, but to draft requirements for high quality design, implementation, and the transparency principles. And you'll see what they look like this afternoon, as well as developing best practices for testing. this is, these areas, for the vast majority of the principles and guidelines, we've had great feedback from the public working groups, but in the area of the high-quality design and implementation, it's a set of principles that are without a working group. And I think that the testing working group would be a great place to carry out that work. And as we move forward, I just want to point out that the requirements and the test methods will continue to be developed using an open and transparent process. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate the update. If any of the members of the committee have questions for Mary, now's the time. Or comments. Doesn't just have to be questions. Okay. I'm sure when we get into the principles and guidelines, we'll have more of that. And I appreciate your overview because it helps encapsulate not only the work that's been done on the principles and guidelines that we're here to talk about today, but that follow through down all the way down to the test assertion level to ensure that the testing's consistent across the laboratories and covers adequately the principles and guidelines at that higher level. So I appreciate all the work that's gone into that. Mr. Hancock, the floor is yours, I think. Mary, if you want to stay there, and if we get additional questions as we go through this, I think that's fine.
It's break time, isn't it?
It's a little early for break, I think, so we'll play it by ear.
So next up is Brian Hancock. He's the Director of Testing and Certification at the EAC. Joining him at the table is Ryan Macias, who works in the Testing and Certification program with Brian. The purpose of this presentation is to walk through if or when you all agree on VVSG 2.0. We'll call it when, and hopefully it's soon, like really soon. What are the next steps? What does the process look like? How will the process proceed? And what are the timelines for that? So to give that perspective. So, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you, TGDC members, Chair Masterson, appreciate it. And I also wanted to thank you for remembering 9/11 as someone that was here in Washington, D.C. On that day, and those folks that were in New York City. I think it changed all of our lives very profoundly, and as you mentioned, it puts into perspective even the very important work that we're doing here today. So wanted to thank you for that. I will go over for the committee. We're assuming that the guidelines will get adopted today or at some point in the very near future. So I think we need to talk a little bit about the review and adoption process after the draft guidelines are approved by this committee. Why is that not?
Ryan also playing the role of IT help desk today.
Oh, it's changing here.
We probably have multiple open. That's what happened with Mary.
I just want to know what's going on with that.
Let's see. Yeah. Just get rid of that one or that one. Either one.
Let me try to show it.
No, just close all of them.
No, okay, well,
This one.
Here's what we're going to do. We are going to take a
There we go.
15-minute break, and we're going to get this laptop where we need it to be so that we're not doing this the rest of the day.
got it.
Are you good?
We're good.
All right.
We're
We're
good.
going to get through this, and then we're going to get that laptop where it needs to be so we're not doing this the rest of the day. All right. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Again, for the review and adoption process, we need to remind ourselves what the requirements of the Help America Vote Act are, right? So in general, the Help America Vote Act requires the publication of the proposed guidelines in the Federal Register, an opportunity for public comment, an opportunity for a public hearing on the record, and publication of the final guidelines in the Federal Register. in a little bit more detail, it states that the executive director of the commission shall take into consideration the recommendations put forward by this committee. That will be the draft VVSG 2.0. That the executive director of the commission shall submit those guidelines that we propose to be adopted to the Board of Advisors and also to the EAC Standards Board. Those boards then will review the proposed guidelines and submit their comments and recommendations on the guidelines to the Election Assistance Commission. The Commission will at some point then vote on the final adoption of the guidelines, but there also needs to be a minimum 90-day public comment period for the guidelines before any of that happens. So let's remind ourselves how we worked this process in the past, and then we'll talk about how we've changed the process and what we're going to be doing to somewhat streamline that process moving forward. So looking back at the original VVSG 1.0, there was a 90-day public comment period. We had 3 public hearings at various places across the country. We had one in New York City, one in Pasadena, and one in Denver, Colorado. We had a 2-day meeting of the EAC Standards Board and EAC Board of Advisors to discuss the VVSG and to receive comments. And for those of you that were part of that, and I know there are probably some in the room that were, it was not the smoothest process. If you remember, the initial guidelines were about 260 pages without the appendix. All right, so that's a very large draft document for the boards to go over in a 2-day period and have reasonable comments and reasonable discussion on. It was very intensive. We kind of broke the boards up into small working group sessions, and essentially staff worked all night working on comments and resolutions, and that certainly was not an efficient way to do things. I think hopefully we'll have a better way this time. In any case, the public comment period and the Standards Board of Advisors review resulted in over 6,500 public comments. The EAC and NIST staff reviewed and considered every single one of those comments. And finally, on December 13th, the Commission voted to adopt the VVSG 1.0 with a 24-month implementation time frame. And I think that's something important to remember as well. There will be an implementation time frame of some sort that goes along with these guidelines. As I said, 24 months for 1.0. I believe we had 18 months for VVSG 1.1, and there will be a reasonable time frame considered here too. We need to remember that after these guidelines are adopted, our voting system test laboratories need to be accredited to test to these guidelines. The voting system manufacturers have to have some reasonable time to develop systems to these guidelines, although hopefully they're looking at them now and sort of seeing where we're headed into the future, so that time frame isn't too extensive. But all of those things play into what that implementation time frame will be eventually. So here is our general VVSG 2.0 review timeline. We will assume that at sometime this month, the executive director will receive the draft VVSG 2.0 from TGDC and NIST. Hopefully by October, we'll provide VVSG 2.0 to the Standards Board and Board of Advisors. By January, we are planning to have a meeting of both the Standards Board and Board of Advisors to consider VVSG 2.0. After that, we will begin the required 90-day public comment period. And so by around the end of April or early May, we'll have all the comments in, hopefully, and EAC and NIST staff will be able to respond to changes from the public comments, comments from the boards, and get all our final formatting done. And our goal is, as a commission, to be able to present VVSG 2.0 to the commissioners for a vote sometime in May of 2018. I think it's aggressive, but it's not too aggressive, and I think it's where we need to go given the current state of affairs and some of the things we've seen over the past year and a half. This is the timeline in just a little bit more of a graphic format. I think one important thing to point out here too, and as I mentioned under the HAVA discussion, there is a requirement for a public hearing, at least one public hearing during this time frame, and so we will have to work that in, although we haven't necessarily determined what month or when those public hearings will be. But it is a requirement, and just to note that it does have to be included in there at some point. We also will have some significant programmatic changes that are taking place along with the VVSG 2.0 review and adoption process, and Ryan Macias is going to talk about that in the next presentation. But at this point, I'm open for some discussion or comments. Thank you.
So we'll open the floor to the committee for discussion of timeframes, process moving forward, and then Ryan will give a presentation on the programmatic changes that the EAC will have to make to the testing and certification program, given the new scope and structure of the VVSG. So any questions for Brian on process? Bob?
Yeah, just where do the requirements fall in that? You know, we had talked about we're going to adopt the standards and then develop the requirements. Where does that fall into the timeline?
Well, as Mary mentioned, the requirements are being worked on now and actually have been being worked on for quite some time. They will continue to be worked on, and I believe those documents will be publicly available for comment as well once they're completed. This committee will have a chance, the Standards Board, the Board of Advisors will have a chance to look at those, and I believe the thought was they would also go out for some sort of public comment period.
Are they going to follow the same timeline? Like, are they going to be finished at the same time? Like, where do they fall in relation to adopting the principles, I guess, is the question.
Do you want to?
So let me see if I can give a primer on that, and then Mary can weigh in. So the requirements, as Mary outlined, are already in development and available through the public working groups right now as part of the work that's going on there. That will continue. Part of what needs to happen in order for the requirements to be completed is the principles and guidelines to get done, so you know that the rest of the scope. So there's some assumptions that NIST and the public working groups are making on scope and whatnot, but have to wait for the finalization to really understand. And so they won't be done, I don't think, immediately upon adoption of VVSG 2.0, but they're not far behind. And perhaps most importantly, they're available. You can go look at them right now as they're being worked on to understand the nature of them, the work, the scope of them, and what they look like. And they don't have to follow the same HAVA prescribed adoption process, which is the key, right? And so that part of the reason I think we all supported the structure of this VVSG is to allow the flexibility for the requirements development, that not only when they're done, but if there's a need to continuously evaluate them and they'll continue to be publicly vetted in that way, that flexibility is within this structure that previously they would have had to go through, this entire HAVA mandated process every single time you want to change one thing. And so that was part of the thought and purpose, as you know, behind this. I don't know, Mary and Ryan. Go ahead, Mary.
I don't really have much to add. I mean, we're certainly working on them as quickly as we possibly can, and I think, part of it really sort of depends on the scope of, I think I'd mentioned this at the, previously is, for instance, if you look at auditability, we can write requirements for auditability. If auditability is, or if we look at some of the security issues, we can write requirements for paper. But, if we have to write requirements for EDE systems, which would be quite a ways out, then there's research that needs to be done there. So there's going to be a timeline from, what's the minimum we can get done to how far down this spectrum do we have to go. And hopefully the minimum won't be too far, beyond, we'll keep it as near to in step as we possibly can.
And just to add to that, actually the next presentation is one of the major changes within the program that we'll be going through and how we transition because as Commissioner had stated, is it's not going to be a one and done, since it doesn't have to be adopted under the old formal process. Is we will be getting into some of the processes that are going to be developed for being able to roll out new requirements and test assertions beyond the initial set to be able to stand up the testing and certification program to the VVSG 2.0.
If I could
McDermott.
just add to that, I mean, when we get the requirements in, we actually will have to put them through putting together test assertions and then make sure that the things are implementable and testable and don't conflict with anything else. The last thing we want is a test assertion in one group conflicting with the test assertion in another. So there's going to have to be a whole lot of work in there to make sure that we have a testable and verifiable set of requirements that can be implemented and actually do what we want them to do.
And the good news is, McDermott, your testing group is going to be the one tasked with looking at and making that consistent, right? We're at that point now to hand that information, still working with the other working groups to ensure that consistency and covering everything that we need to.
As soon as my test plan is done, I'm all yours.
David Wagner.
David Wagner, could we get a little more specificity about the plan with the requirement development? Will those be drafted by this committee? Will there be a vote by the committee on the proposed requirements? What is the committee's role are we developing recommended requirements that we transmit to the EAC? Can you talk us through that a little more?
Sure. The goal is to engage you all in the requirements, at least review process. Again, it doesn't have to, you all under HAVA won't need to do a formal vote, although you could. That's up to you all as a advisory committee. But the work would continue under the public working groups, and then the communication via NIST and the EAC to you of the requirements will continue. We can continue to have TGDC meetings to go through the requirements, to review them, but there isn't a requirement for a formal vote per se by you all, but absolutely the plan is to continue to engage from public working groups all the way on up to you all in the requirements development process to make sure that we're consistent with your principles and guidelines and the principles and guidelines that the EAC ends up adopting at the end. So your work continues, I guess, is the answer.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we adopt the milestone calendar for VVSG 2.0 as presented.
Wow. Well, there's a motion on the table, and so is there a second? Okay. Second by Bob Giles, and so now we'll open for discussion on the motion to adopt this timeline.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. And this is probably an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. You talked a little bit about the things that have to go into the timeline, obviously, the requirements, spooling up the test labs. There's a lot that needs to be done. As a local election official, and I'm sure my colleagues are wondering the same thing, do we have any idea, and this could be a guess, when there might be product on the street under VVSG 2.0 that we could actually implement?
So let me clarify one part if I can, and then sure. And then they can answer. None of that impacts this timeline, to be clear, right? Yeah. And so this timeline, so the motion on this timeline, which would serve as guidance to the EAC and NIST to get this done in this timeline, isn't impacted by that. But perhaps McDermott's maybe the best person to answer. Generally speaking, timeframes as far as build and design to the guidelines and requirements.
I'm guessing. It's a somewhat educated guess, but it's still just a guess. Once we have the standards in front of us, and more importantly, the test assertions, so we know what it needs to do, though we do have to talk about what the process will be for adding test assertions or changing test assertions, and what sort of process that has to go through, and what the impacts are if we're changing something that's people are currently working on. But the scope of this it impacts all systems across the board. There's not going to be a whole lot of systems that can be updated to this, which means you're kind of starting from scratch. So you're probably looking on really closely, probably a 24-month development cycle plus then testing. And as you saw on the list, for the 1.1, we already have 1,200 test assertions. That's a lot of testing. And the process can go anywhere from 3 months to over a year. So you're probably looking at about 3 months or 3 years between adoption and on the street.
Right, and it's going to depend on the implementation time frame, because what we've seen in the past is that the implementation time frame oftentimes drives the vendor's product, right? So for 1.0, it was 24 months. So automatically, let's just use that as an assumption, that would be 2020, and then testing on top of that. So reasonably mid-2021, something like that. I mean, even optimistically.
I would just add, though, optimistically, that the two things. The requirements and test assertions that exist now are currently public and available. And so at least there is more of a lead. So 2005 VVSG, the vendors had to take from square one and go, right, from the time that it was adopted. Here, there is the information's already available largely on big chunks. And a great deal of it is stuff they're already familiar with. And although the requirements may change a bit, they know generally how it would be tested and evaluated. And so I like to believe that private industry is enterprising and sees an opportunity here, and that perhaps those time frames will be more aggressive because of the opportunity. But that perhaps I'm overly optimistic on that.
Well, the other thing we have to think about is election officials, right, Neil? So there are a lot of folks that have either very recently or perhaps in the next 6 months or so going to change over to new equipment, right? I don't think those folks are going to want to then turn around and buy new equipment again 2 years from now or 2.5 years from now. Right. Right.
Thank you for answering an unfair question.
So we have a motion on the table about the schedule. Diane Golden.
I think I'm going to ask if perhaps we could table that motion until we actually vote on it just seems odd to me to vote on a timeline for something we haven't adopted yet. And not that I'm anticipating something going horribly wrong with the adoption process.
Thank you for saying that.
However, yeah, it just seems like the timeline should come after the the principles and guidelines are adopted. And since I have the microphone, I will say I will bow down and praise someone if we actually have something certified to 2.0 in 2020, because I've been waiting for accessibility now to the commission or somebody. That would be delightful if we have something by 2020. I'm hoping there's something before I'm dead, quite frankly. So anyway.
So
just to follow up, and as part of that discussion, but if that has to change, that was my concern. Are we locking ourselves into an absolute timeline if we adopt this, or are we just using this as a guide once and I agree we might want to take
so anything you all would adopt or vote on is a recommendation in the end, right? And so in theory, the EAC and NIST could choose to ignore it or do the best they can or anything in between. It doesn't lock you all into anything. It would be a strong encouragement to us to meet our own timeframes, right? And so that I will ask before we get to you, Mark, the maker of the motion, are you willing to either withdraw the motion until such time as there's a vote on the or table the motion until such time per Diane's request?
You just have to ask Bob if he'll withdraw the second.
Yeah.
I withdraw my second. Then there is no second.
Yeah. Okay.
Get out of it.
Yeah, right. But I think we'll all note the importance of the timeline, and we can revisit it as we visit a vote on the principles and guidelines and we can even draft a resolution to it.
Thanks, Matt. I was going to second Diane's motion to table, but since we don't have
Yeah,
to do that, I just wanted to mention, and I know there's not a specific timeline given, but I just wanted to ask that you consider avoiding a conflict in January with the Access Board meeting, because, you know, it might be handy for you to use our offices at that time, but and those dates are January 8th through the 10th, just as an FYI. Thank you.
David Wagner. I wanted to follow up a little more about the requirements. I think the requirements are very important, and one of the discussions we've been hearing multiple times in the cybersecurity working group is, what does this principle mean? What does that guideline mean? Well, what it really means is going to be determined by what the text of the requirements are, because those are what is actually going to have to, the equipment's going to have to comply with. So that's going to determine how those are interpreted, which...
Or proved.
Exactly. Which then influences how we evaluate those principles and guidelines. So I guess I want to probe a little further to understand how that plays into this. Will the requirements be part of the recommended VVSG that the TGDC is recommending be adopted, or be part of the final VVSG that's adopted by the EAC? Will they be available for public comment? Will there be a public comment period on the requirements? Can we commit that the TGDC will have a chance to comment on the requirements? So how will they play into this? And if they won't be available, then how will members of the public comment on the proposed standard without knowing what the implementation is, the requirements that implement these guidelines?
Yeah, thank you, David. I think we already mentioned that, yes, they will be, all of those things, essentially. They will be available for a public comment period. Standards Board, Board of Advisors, TGDC will get those to comment on. The only thing is they will not be technically part of the VVSG 2.0. They will be an adjunct, documents that are always with VVSG 2.0, but as we've talked about actually for the past year and a half or so, we want to be a little bit more nimble when requirements need to be changed or slightly modified, or new technology comes in, and that's sort of the whole concept behind the new scope and structure.
And I think Ryan's presentation will speak to some of this, and so maybe we do Ryan's, and then if you have follow-up needing more detail on that, we can dig into that.
Ryan, are you also going to discuss about the process for changing and who ultimately signs off on these requirements?
So it'll be getting into all of that. The process is yet to be developed, but that is a major part of the discussion, is all the steps that need to take place and a timeline for what our program has to do to be able to implement requirements, test assertions, to be able to test to the VVSG 2.0, and the process for getting a transition time frame, and the steps that we are already taking and where we are in that process right now.
Go for it.
Well, good morning, everybody. Ryan Macias here, and as we have been talking about, this is transitioning to VVSG 2.0, and Brian hit on some of the steps along the way, but we're going to dig into them a little bit more, because as we know, with the VVSG 1.1, with VVSG 1.0, through the learning curves of the adoption of those, we've realized all the things that need to be put in place internally at the EAC to go along with being able to test to those requirements and to those test assertions. And so we're going to start here where we are with the standards right now. As we know, the VVSG 1.0, most EAC certified systems are certified to the standard. New systems can no longer be submitted to the standard, but modifications can continue to be tested to the 1.0. So if there is a system that is certified to the 1.0, then it may remain and have modifications made to that system moving forward. And we've also worked out a process with the manufacturers and had a request for interpretation and an interpretation that was made on the determination of what is a new system and when they would have to be upgraded to VVSG 1.1. With that stated, currently, as of July 6, 2017, all new systems must be tested to the VVSG 1.1. At this current time, we do not have any applications submitted to the VVSG 1.1. And internally with the VVSG 2.0, we are developing the implementation plan and obviously, hopefully, adopting it here today. So here's another picture of kind of the process that Brian had laid out, and as you can see, we're sitting in the green box, and what this discussion is how do we get to the red box, and there's a whole bunch in between that was already described from an external source and how it works with the VVSG 2.0 in and of itself, but really we're going to focus here on the programmatic side of things. So implementation plan, the time frame and considerations. We have to develop testing and certification program policies, processes, and procedures. Most of you know that as the testing and certification and the voting system testing lab manuals. These expire in 2018 based on the way that they were adopted in the past. But in order to move them forward and make them look more like the VVSG, they will probably be broken out into policies that would be adopted, process and procedures that would be more implementable internally. As we've been talking about here, we have to have manufacturers' research and development to the new standards. We have to make sure that the labs can implement and test to the VVSG 2.0. So they need to know what the requirements and the test assertions are. And then we need to know what the impact is on the states and locals, both from a purchasing standpoint, from an equipment standpoint, from a technology standpoint, and what we've already been discussing in this implementation plan at a few of the conferences that we've gone to is the glossary of terms, things that the states and locals should be considering and looking at. What we know is that there may be terms that are in the requirements and test assertions that fit a majority of the states, but some states have direct conflicts with. And so they have to start thinking about their interpretations at a state level for what that means and how to be able to implement these systems or what those interpretations may be at the local level. So what are the required documents that have to be developed? Well, we have to have the document called the requirements and test assertions that we've been talking about this morning. We have to have the commission's policy for the testing and certification program. Well, basically, as we know now, what is called the manuals. And the manuals are adopted by the commission. And currently, they have a 3-year lifespan that ends in 2018. And then, as I was stating, breaking it down from a policies and procedure standpoint, we have to have a bunch of procedural manuals. And the ones that we've been talking about internally is implementing the requirements and test assertions. So to your point, McDermott, this would be, what that process would be for implementing that document that's up at the top, the requirements and test assertions. Whether there would be modifications or whether there would just be additions based on technologies that come out and interfaces that come out on new technologies. So this is a procedural document that will be worked on. The manufacturer's registration process, if there's going to be any changes to that, voting system testing laboratory accreditation process. We know there'll be changes to that because they have to be accredited to the specific VVSG. Currently, they're both accredited to VVSG 1.0 and VVSG 1.1, but there's going to be a process for bringing them up to speed to 2.0. And then there's going to be the voting system testing and certification. Just what we call now the testing and certification manual. What are the steps and the processes for testing and certifying voting equipment, particularly to this new realm of requirements and test assertions? Right now it says that every voting system has to be tested to all requirements. Is that going to continue to be the case when we have these sets of requirements and test assertions that may not be applicable to the system? We've had to work on that through a request for interpretation process and a notice of clarification process internally right now. Is that going to be the same, or with this more agile approach as we're developing the implementation for requirements and test assertions, would it be something through that process? We have the common data formats that we're going to hear about a lot more later today, but that is part of the interoperability, is developing these common data formats, and how do we implement those into the requirements and test assertions. So those will have to continue to be adopted. And then the glossary of terms. It's something we've talked about a lot, both through a CDF work, but also internally, is developing a glossary that will hopefully be able to be create synonyms and grabbing glossaries that are already developed and being able to associate it to all the different terms that are in use across the nation, both by the states and locals, but also by others in the elections realm, and trying to develop that glossary. So that's also currently under work. So what are the steps? As stated, the commissioners will have to adopt those policies for the testing and certification program. The testing and certification program is going to have to formalize and distribute all of those procedures that were just talked about on the last page. Testing and certification program is going to have to, after formalizing the process for implementing the requirements and test assertion, is going to have a process for publishing. And as we have stated here, it's going to involve you guys, it's going to involve the other advisory boards, and then some way of doing a formal adoption or a formal publication by the EAC and the testing and certification program once they've been developed. We're going to have to go through the accreditation process after the test labs, the process for accrediting them has been developed, to make sure that they understand not just the procedures, but the requirements and test assertions that they're going to be testing to, and make sure that they have all their test cases developed to those. We're going to have to train the manufacturers on the testing certification process, procedures, requirements, and test assertions. And right now, we actually have a tentative October meeting scheduled to go through some of these. And so I'm going to put myself on the spot, and probably Brian and everybody else, but it's my hope to have those procedure documents, at least in draft form, along with presentations to the manufacturers to start discussing what those procedures are for the manufacturer registration, accreditation process, and testing and certification process, since they have to be adopted by 2018, and to start those discussions and potentially even start public working groups with the manufacturers and the VSTLs, the Voting System Test Laboratories, for the continued improvement on those process and procedures document. And then informing the state and locals on these updates. Again, there's going to be that gap analysis and the transition from 1.1 to 2.0 on each of the principles and guidelines this afternoon. And this transition discussion has already taken place a few times with the states and locals, between NASED and IGO, and a few other conferences that we've spoke with about the new process for getting there. Oop. So where are we? With the requirements and test assertions, they're under development, as we've been talking about, and they're going to continue their development. I don't have anything more at this time on a date for that, but they are still under development, and continuing to be worked on. Hopefully us as the testing group will begin to look at the gap analysis between the requirements that have been developed and the test assertions that are already out there. As well as if there's any test assertions that were out there from 1.0 or 1.1 that could then help feed back into the requirements, or at least back to the public working groups for developing those requirements, the specific groups. The common data format models, we're going to get into that more later, just as the requirements and test assertions, so I'm going to breeze past those. The glossary, we're currently doing work on that. I'm not sure if the presentation around the common data format models will be discussing the glossary or not, but that is in development currently, and we're looking at methods and modes of putting together that glossary. The Commission's policy for testing and certification program and the testing and certification program procedural manuals. Again, these were one document in the past, or two documents in essence, the testing and certification program manual and the VSTL manual. But to make it look more like the VVSG, having more of a high-level policy document similar to the principles and guidelines that would be adopted by the Commission, and then the program procedure manuals. And so far, these are the four broken out there that we have identified internally that need to be developed. As stated, at least the last three are in draft mode and will hopefully be shared internally with the manufacturers and the VISTLs to get them to a place where they could be shared more publicly, hopefully at this January advisory board meeting that we are talking about, and back with you guys as well for full implementation. Again, I'm going to put this as a hope. A hope is that this would, both the policy would already have been voted on or voted on alongside the VVSG 2.0 by the commissioners, as well as having the testing and certification manuals ready to roll out at the same time frame. So if nothing else, whether or not the requirements and test assertions will be rolled out at that same time, the process for rolling them out will be clear by the time that there is an adoption of the VVSG 2.0. So that is that's where we are. The process is continuing forward, moving quickly, but there's a whole lot of work being done. As I stated when I opened the presentation, we don't want to have you guys vote on the VVSG 2.0 and say, now what do we do as a testing and certification program to make sure that we can begin testing to this. The hope is, requirements and test assertions aside, that at least the process and procedures and the accreditation that are necessary, all the steps that must be taken when the EAC commissioners vote on the VVSG 2.0, we as the testing and certification program say we can now, that day or the very next day can begin taking those steps that are necessary to move forward. But all of that will be wrapped into what we will call the implementation plan, because we know that the manufacturers are going to need time for R&D and the like, but at least everything will be laid out and clear for what those steps are. And that's it.
Okay, we'll open for questions, and I'm actually going to start, and that is that the program manuals, like the requirements and like the test assertions, also go out for public comment as well as going through our boards and everything else, correct?
That is correct. And so, yeah, that's the hope for why for October we will have the draft with the manufacturers and the labs, and then hopefully getting them into a more formalized where we could roll them out for the January meeting as well to the Board of Advisors and Standards Board, and how we will stand those up or when the next meeting will be here with this group, or whether it be submission via email. We will definitely take comment on those and be able to make any changes to them as necessary.
Lori, Gina.
I would encourage you, can you hear me? I would encourage you to not lose sight of the process that we have developed up to this point that's been successful. Can you guys hear me in the back now? Better? No? I know it's working. I would like to encourage you not to lose sight of the process that's worked pretty successfully up to this point in garnering this body and the public working groups on those test assertions and requirements documents. I personally would like to have an opportunity to review and provide comment through a working group methodology, and I think it ties into David Wagner's comments earlier, that this body might be the most appropriate body to be working with first before you're rolling out to the Standards Board or Board of Advisors. We're a smaller working group that can provide, or a committee that can provide, good feedback. And this is where the rubber meets the road. And so not losing sight of continuing to use us and follow that process that's been successful up to this point.
Yeah, and so just to be clear to answer that, from the requirements and test assertion standpoint, from I don't want to speak for everybody, but from my personal perspective, is that process will continue. The public working groups will be the ones that will be working on the requirements and test assertions and continue that process forward. When I was talking about the document is the implementing those process and procedures, and that would definitely go to you guys as a board as well. It just is not ready for today. So again, I would be more than willing to email it out to you guys in advance or around the same time as the Standards Board and Board of Advisors. But the hope from a progression standpoint is that it would be at least public for the boards by the January meeting.
David Wagner. I also wanted to follow up on the requirements since, Commissioner, you invited me to continue after, and I'm sure you'll regret that. So I guess I just want to put in a word of encouragement to think about how to make clear what the process for the requirements and the testable assertions is. I find it murky in my head. For the rest of the work we've done on the standards, I found the process and the ownership very clear. The TGDC is an advisory body only, but we are ultimately responsible for developing the TGDC recommended proposal, which we have the control and the responsibility for producing, we vote on. We have the assistance of NIST, but we have the final responsibility, and then we transmit that on to EAC, and it's merely an advisory document. I'm not clear on how the requirements and test assertions will be developed. I think you might want to consider, for instance, a role like that. I would find it helpful to know where we stand in that. Are we engaged? Are we providing comment? Do we have ownership over our recommended requirements? Is it NIST that is in control of those? Is it the TGDC's product? Thank you.
One, I take that encouragement seriously and absolutely hear it. Let me see if I can put this more clearly than we have. The requirements and test assertion process will mirror the VVSG development process, except for there is no legal mandate for you all to have to make those recommendations. Is that a clear? Because I understand what you're saying, but yes, it will go through the exact same process. It's in the working groups right now. They're working through them. You can go look at them now, but we will put them through you all, the boards, and the general public to comment on as we do the VVSG in the same way. But I hear you, and so the need to put that out in a clearer document so that everyone understands the process. I hear you on that.
Hopefully, to clarify a little bit more, the concept that Mark and I have been working on this is that now that the requirements are coming out, our group is going to start taking those piece by piece and working on the assertions, working off what we've already got, and then returning those back to the working groups, highlighting any inconsistencies, any gaps, any issues, so that they can then put them into their own discussions, and it'll kind of go back and forth on that until we finally come up with something that is a solid recommendation. I have a follow-up question on this. Despite the infallibility of Robert Giles and others, it is entirely possible that when we put together the requirements, that we will find things in conflict in this document. I've seen a couple of places already that on the surface the VVSG looks good, but if you dig down into practical requirements, depending on how those are defined, we could actually wind up in conflict and, in fact, shutting down some very promising advances in technology. I am wondering what is our process, assuming that we do move forward with a vote today, for amending these conflicts if we find them when we dig down into the requirements, because as David said, the requirements are going to impact the principles and guidelines significantly.
Neil Kelly. Ryan, I just have a process question. I'm a little unclear on, is it the cart before the horse a little bit on the manuals coming before the requirements are fully fleshed out, or help me understand that?
Yeah, so the manuals are already out right now. And they have an expiration date. And this is really about how to submit an application, goes into a test plan, what goes into the testing process, and same with the registering manufacturers, how you become a registered manufacturer, how you become a voting system test lab. And then the process for accreditation then takes the requirements and test assertions, it's basically an auditing process that also works with the NVLAP, the NIST NVLAP process, to run through auditing to make sure that they can accumulate everything together and be able to test to it. But from a process standpoint, so two things. One is now doing the structured tier the way that we did with the VVSG. If there does need to be modifications, then we would be able to make those. But more so from the process standpoint, there's not going to be much different than what we have seen coming out of the manuals. The structure is going to look different, but it's really how a manufacturer submits their application, what the steps are before getting to a certification decision, what happens with a certification decision, rolling out those types of things. So I don't think that there would be, I don't think it's putting the cart before the horse.
Ryan, would you mind to reiterate my question? What is our process for changing this VVSG if the requirements wind up in conflict?
Yeah, so I'll attempt to answer it. One is, I mean, there's a formal process in HAVA that requires you all to approve changes to the VVSG. So we'd have to go back through the TGDC process like we've been doing since 2015. Which is exactly why we're moving the requirements where we are, right? This is why we chose the structure we chose, so that in order to change each and every requirement, it doesn't involve a 2 to 3 year process, right? And so the process is going to be evaluating the requirements. If there's a conflict that would necessitate a change in the VVSG, we would have to come back to this table and go through the VVSG process. I would hope we could resolve that through the requirements vetting process. And I know NIST has this experience in other areas. I don't know. Don't mean to put you on the spot.
Thank you. So in our mind, this is not dissimilar from our cybersecurity framework that's been pretty successful. And the way that works is we do have a high-level framework that provides guidelines and principles and are actually easily understandable so that people at the highest levels of decision making can understand what the goals are. But underneath these are the very detailed technical specifications. And then those can change as they do, as technology changes, as markets change. And those can change actually fairly dynamically without these being in conflict typically. Now, if things do change so dramatically, as Matt said, then yes, you would have to revisit. But in the meantime, what this is doing is also setting an expectation, right? Because you've said these are the principles that we're looking for the underlying regulations and standards to meet. So if the conflict issue that you pointed out arose, ideally, yes, that would be dealt with at the working group level, perhaps by making sure that they are aligning with principles appropriately, or perhaps by making sure that any redundant working groups start to merge, or that you parse the specific technical goal within one. So there is going to be management in those lower levels, definitely. But ideally, much of the high level thinking can be contained here and be somewhat static, at least on the year's time frame. Mary, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's correct. It's I as much as we would love to say, we're going to vote on this and we're going to accept it and we're done. Standards don't work that way. Nothing that involves technology works that way. And I think the processes are in place that if as we're going down the requirements path, if it can't be solved in the requirements or the manuals or processes and procedures, that we have the opportunity to come back and and modify as we go along. I mean, that's all the processes are in place, the groups are in place, the procedures that were set out in HAVA still apply.
Diane?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would hope that the requirements, you can resolve that at the requirements level rather than coming back to the principles and guidelines. To me, the principle and guidelines are sort of like motherhood apple pie, and I mean, how could you disagree? Pretty much, it's the requirements where reality and those specific conflicts and how you resolve them. I would hope that's resolved at that level. But I would echo the fact that there will be issues there, and I'm hoping this group can resolve those, because otherwise they're daunting and may not be resolvable, or they'll be resolved in the court of public opinion, which is not necessarily the best resolution in a lot of cases. So.
Okay.
Just one more thing. I'm
You
sorry.
had to throw something in, Jersey.
Yeah, I did. So how does the balance between requirements and test assertions and the potential conflicts there, like as we're moving forward, are you going to develop a requirement, then the test assertion before we adopt the requirement, that we can make sure it is testable, or are we going to do them on separate paths? How's that going to work?
That's a great question. And then let me just use a phrase from Commissioner Masterson. It depends. Certainly if they're ready to be presented at the same time, that makes a great deal of sense. But if in fact they're offset, we certainly don't want a situation where we have test assertions and no requirements, right? There's a certain path that has to be followed, and if in some cases, some of the groups will be ready to present, a set of them at the same time. And I would expect that we'll follow a process similar to what we've already done. That, the idea is to present the information to you as we go along in smaller chunks, so they can be reasonably reviewed, and we can receive comment back and go through this iterative process till we get to where we want to be. As a community.
And Diane, there's always someone that doesn't like apple pie, so I'm sure we'll get to that point. But okay, we're due for a break. We're going to break for about 15 minutes to 11 o'clock or so. In the meantime, we're going to get the laptop more functional for us, I hope. And then re-adjourn around 11 o'clock. And again, bathrooms out the doors there. And if you are not a government employee and you're here, you do get re-scanned by security if you come back through. So just be aware. So we'll re-adjourn at 11.